Chapter 1141. Fortunately for Tatiana, the slap didn't sting that much because Mason hadn't fully recovered. However, there was a red mark on her cheek. "You slapped me. How could you slap me? Who am I doing this for? It's all for you," she sobbed. She continued, "I know that you admire Ethan. Back then, you were afraid that it would be difficult for him to stand on his feet alone, so you pushed Yale up. You chose Yale because Linus was away from us. I know how much you approve of Ethan all these years. If we can make him our son-in-law, it can solve all of the problems. I'm not doing this for Crystal. I'm doing this for our family, for our families. I'm also thinking about our future generation. Still, you shouldn't have resorted to such underhanded means. What will he think of you in the future? What will he think of me? He's a divorced man, but we're marrying our daughter to him. He's not in the position to complain when even we're not saying anything." Mason took a sip of tea to calm himself down. "You're being ridiculous. Mason, I know that you're blaming me because this is not an honest move. But what other ideas do we have? Things have come this far, and we don't have any other choice. Mason, we're on the same team now." She patted the back of his hand and added, "Mason, I'll deal with the consequences for the deeds done. You don't have to do anything. All you have to do is support me. I will never acknowledge nor support such a plan." He stood up and spared her a cold glance. "If Ethan were so easy to deal with, I wouldn't have wasted so many years." "What do you mean?" "Nothing. Some things aren't as simple as you think they are." He turned around and left. Tatiana and Mason had been sleeping in different rooms for a long time. All this time, she assumed that he was simply exhausted from work. But the truth was, he didn't want to touch her at all. That year, she drugged him. Apart from his lacking status, another reason why he went along with it was because he needed the Benson family's support. However, that didn't mean that he could accept the incident. Even after all these years, it was a thorn in his flesh. Hence, they had been sleeping in separate rooms for over 10 years already. When he no longer needed the Benson family to consolidate his position, he stopped touching her. This time, Tatiana used the same method on Ethan. Considering how much Ethan loved Olivia, Mason reckoned that Ethan wouldn't commit such a mistake. Nevertheless, Tatiana didn't agree with Mason. The maid clearly heard someone making love in the room. How could that be fake? Now, all Tatiana had to do was wait for the morning sun to rise. In fact, she was satisfied with the idea of Ethan becoming her son-in-law. Aside from the fact that he had an ex-wife and children, he was a nobleman. She thought, it's not like I can't overlook that. Men need experience to learn how to love someone, don't they? She was more excited than Crystal, so she slept late. In the end, she slept for only 4 hours. As soon as the sky brightened, the maid woke her up. She had an important mission to do today, to catch Ethan and Crystal together on the scene. Tatiana called for Mason and Linus early in the morning. Linus didn't know what was going on at the moment. "Mom, I haven't finished my morning exercise yet. Where are you taking me to?" "Of course, it's somewhere important. Aren't we heading to Crystal's room? I bet she hasn't woken up yet. Is there something you want to talk with her about?" She scoffed at her foolish son. "Just zip it and watch me." She motioned for the maid to open the door. The latter nodded and knocked on the door. Chapter 1142. Right after the maid knocked on the door, Crystal screamed inside the room, "Why are you here?" Tatiana, who thought that Crystal was putting on an act, barged into the room. "Crystal, are you all right?" Crystal covered her body with the blanket when the door was opened. Teary-eyed, she pointed at the man who shouldn't be there. Even her voice was trembling. Why are you here?" Linus was the only person clueless about the plan, so he didn't know what was going on. Meanwhile, Mason's expression was grim. He wasn't surprised to see Yale instead of Ethan. It wouldn't have been that interesting if Ethan was such an easy man to be taken down. Tatiana looked at Yale, whose torso was bare. Her complexion wasn't any better than Crystal's. You, Linus punched him in the face. "Why are you in Crystal's room?" Yale wore an innocent expression. "Last night, Crystal asked me to come to her room to tell me something. So, I came. But the lights weren't turned on when I entered the room. She threw herself at me and confessed her feelings. I had drunk too much, and I was feeling dizzy. Besides, I've liked her for so many years. So, I failed to hold myself back. No, that's not what happened. Crystal cried. I didn't ask you to come. You entered the room yourself. Crystal, are you implying that I forced it on you? Mr. Heath, Mrs. Heath, this is your place. How could I do such a thing? I wouldn't have touched her without her consent. Crystal slapped him without holding herself back. Nonsense. You set me up. Linus slowly regained his composure. Staring at the scattering clothes, he could tell that the night had been a wild one. Yale was right about something. If it hadn't been consensual, Crystal could have just screamed. This was the Heath residence. The maids would have entered the room to stop it the moment Crystal alerted them. Thus, it was obvious that she didn't fight back. She even enjoyed it. There were love marks all over Yale's exposed skin, including love bites and scratches. Although Linus didn't know what happened, the clues so far were leading to one thing: Crystal did it willingly. He slowly released his fists. At the same time, Tatiana could already figure out the consequences. They had been used. Still, Crystal couldn't accept what had transpired. She threw a tantrum in the room. Olivia, who was in Ethan's arms, opened her eyes groggily. What's going on? Who knows? Said the man who was close to her lips. It's getting brighter soon. Stop. You should know where the line is. She shoved him away. The corner of his lips twitched. Liv, you told me something different last night. How irresponsible of you. She scoffed. I'm going to watch the show. You should leave in the meantime. Olivia could tell that it was Crystal's voice. Considering that she was wailing so loudly early in the morning, something must have happened. She washed up for a while before heading to Crystal's room. She clucked her tongue, thinking, I'm glad I didn't miss it. Chapter 1143. Crystal bulldozed at Yale, hitting him while shouting, this is a trap. He let her be, showing no sign of fighting back. Tatiana pulled Crystal in an attempt to stop her. Mason's expression was grim because he had guessed the consequences ahead. He had figured that Ethan wouldn't fall for the trap, but he didn't expect Yale to be this daring to touch his daughter. However, it happened under Crystal's consent. Thus, Yale appeared to be the passive party. Now that things have turned out this way, I'm willing to take responsibility for Crystal. Crystal charged at him like a mad woman upon hearing that. What did you say? I don't need that. I'm a man. I'm not that cruel, Crystal. Furious, she scratched his face. Enough. Put on your clothes and leave the talking to later. Mason couldn't stand it any longer. Tear-stricken, Crystal turned around, only to realize Olivia was watching the show. Crystal threw a pillow at Olivia in a fit of fury. What are you looking at, bitch? Leave. Crossing her arms, Olivia moved her head sideways to dodge the attack. She stifled a smile and asked genuinely, I heard you crying, Miss Heath. What happened? Do you need my help? Crystal would never buy that. She was certain that Olivia was here to watch a show. Leave. We don't need you here. Linus quickly chastised her. Shut up. He then looked at Olivia apologetically. Just some family matters. Sorry for the inconvenience. Olivia expressed indifferently, Mr. Heath, you haven't fully recovered. Please avoid as much emotional stress as possible. Mason was exasperated at this point, for such a humiliating thing had happened in the household. Yale had completely fooled the Heaths. The target Mason wanted to be closely acquainted with was the Millers, not the Kingstons. Yet, Yale and Crystal had had sex. Whether it was under Crystal's consent or not, Mason had to acknowledge that matter nevertheless. It would seem like Yale was taking responsibility, but in fact, the Heaths would be giving him a title. While everyone was focused on Crystal, Olivia was the only person worrying about Mason's health. He raised his hand, and Olivia walked up to him to support him to leave. Mr. Heath, you should get some rest and clear up your mind a bit. She walked him to the study. After lighting a scented candle, she brewed tea for him. Are you feeling better, Grandpa Mason? He nodded. I'm embarrassed to have you see that. Miss Heath is a simple woman, so she's easily deceived. She's not the one to be blamed. She didn't ask for that either. He was surprised by her reaction. She keeps putting you in a difficult position, but you're still putting in a good word for her. Sigh. Olivia crouched next to him with a smile. Why should I fight with a spoiled kid? Since you have to deal with that matter as soon as possible, I shall make you some pasta real quick. Anything will do. She went to the yard to pluck some herbs to be added. She also fried a piece of steak to add the finishing touch. It was simple, but it smelled good. Your cooking never fails to work up my appetite. It wasn't a complicated dish, but the home-cooked meal made him salivate. Mason stared at the mature Olivia, wondering how good it would be if she was his daughter. Chapter 1144. Olivia and Mason had pasta together. The meal definitely warmed them up. Feeling better now. Otherwise, you can have another bowl of pasta. She smiled. He caressed her head. Your way of comforting is quite distinctive. Neither Ms. Heath nor you wanted that to happen. Now that things turned out this way, there's no use thinking about it anymore. Don't let it take a toll on your health. He didn't say a word about it, but she was clever enough to figure it out. You're not only good at treating people. Would you like to work for me? Mason offered sincerely. Olivia shook her head. I think there's more freedom to move around places. I might leave once you recover. I should prepare your medications. I bet Miss Heath is ready too. Mason watched her leave. Her maturity rendered it difficult for him to let her go. She was a rare prodigy. A group of people entered Crystal's room, where she was crying while more marks adorned Yale's face. Tatiana and Linus wore long faces as they didn't say a word. Linus didn't like Yale to begin with. Besides, he had yet to get to the bottom of the assassination case. If the culprit was either Ethan or Yale, Linus' guess was more inclined to Yale. Linus would never let Yale become his brother-in-law, but Crystal's deed might make that impossible. Linus, the solemn man, stared at the two wordlessly. Tatiana shared the same notion. She started thinking about her decision. She went out for wool and came home shorn, ending up marrying Crystal to another man. Mason set his teacup down. The silence was deafening. Say, how are you guys going to handle this matter? Yale stood up first with a sincere expression. I've had feelings for Crystal since long ago. Regardless if it was an accident or not, it's undeniable that it happened. I'll take the responsibility. Mr. Heath, please entrust your daughter to me. No, why must I marry you? Crystal cried. I'd rather stay single forever. Stop spouting nonsense. Tatiana chided. Crystal threw herself into her arms. Mom, how did it turn out this way? I don't wanna marry Yale. Not even in hell. Forget about having sex with Yale. Did she really have to marry him? Yale continued. Crystal, I genuinely like you. I promise that I'll treat you well. Who's asking you to do that? Before she finished, a maid rushed over and whispered in Mason's ear, the Kingstons are here. It seemed like Yale had called over his family, worried that the Heath family might cover up the incident. Crystal slammed the table. You called your family over. Just what are you up to? His back was straight, and he wore a sincere expression. I called my father as soon as the incident happened. We'll take responsibility for it. I bet he's here to propose a marriage. Tatiana's expression was cold. To propose a marriage, or to force a marriage. I don't quite get that, Mrs. Heath. I shouldn't keep quiet about it when Crystal has given her first to me, should I? I'm an honest man, he countered. Chapter 1145. Tatiana gritted her teeth, not expecting herself to be played a fool by a youngster. There was no way out from this now. Yale was clearly feigning innocence after seizing the opening to take advantage of them. Meanwhile, there was nothing to say about Crystal, who merely cried and cried. Although Mason and Linus were aware that it was a trap, Yale didn't give them the room to take back their words because the Kingstons were already here. If they objected to the marriage and word of it got out, Crystal's reputation would be tarnished. Putting that aside, the Heath family's name mattered more. They had no choice but to go along with Yale. Let's go to the living. Don't keep them waiting too long. Mason rose to his feet. Yale hurriedly followed suit. Hugging Linus' arm, Crystal pleaded, Linus, please save me. I'm begging you. Please save me. You're my only hope now. Save you. Explain. What happened last night? Don't you hate him? Why didn't you scream for help? That was the one thing he could never understand. They wouldn't have to be this passive if they could prove that Crystal was forced. His question put her in a difficult position. How am I supposed to help you when you can't tell me anything? Crystal recounted the incident in an undertone. His expression changed after he heard that. You had it coming. How could you do that? What do you take Ethan for? Drugging someone is only useful when that person likes you. He'll never touch you because he doesn't like you. Linus, I know that I was wrong. But what's done is done. What should I do? He let out a sigh. Since things have turned out this way, let's see what Dad has to say. As you know, Yale is not a simple man. Now that he has seized the chance, even wars required battle plans. Yale came prepared, but Linus was at his wits' ends. All Linus could do was take it step by step. Crystal watched Linus leave. At this point, there was only one person who could save her. She dialed Ethan's number with trembling hands. Ethan, please save me. Ethan was still in Olivia's room, with his arms wrapped around her waist. Save you? Did something happen to you? He asked on purpose. Something happened between Yale and me, and he's insisting on marrying me. His family is here too. How do you want me to save you? He inquired as mockery tinged his tone. If you steal me away from him, I won't need to marry him. She sobbed. I seriously don't have another solution for this. Please help me, Ethan. Please. I don't wanna marry him. I'd rather die. Crystal, do you think that it's possible? I don't even love you, so why should I steal you away from him? Plus, I'm not acquainted with him. Considering that his family is here, you're trying to drive a wedge between us, aren't you? Do you know what will happen thereafter? You'll have to take the responsibility when the time comes. A lecture wasn't what Crystal wanted to hear right now. Teary-eyed, she asked, why didn't you come to my room last night? I was waiting for you. You should be the one responsible for this. Why would I enter a lady's room at such a late hour? Don't tell me that Yale entered your room last night. What did you guys do? Olivia heard the conversation loud and clear. Ethan was indeed evil to rub salt on Crystal's wound. Setting Ethan up was definitely Crystal's worst decision. Chapter 1146. Crystal struggled to find the words to answer that. If she told Ethan what she had planned to do to him last night, he wouldn't let her get away with it. He asked implicitly, did you guys perhaps do the deed? I didn't know that it was him. I thought it was you. She closed her eyes, confessing everything. If I had gone over last night, would I be the one in Yale's shoes right now? Crystal didn't know how to answer that. Her silence was the answer to everything. Ethan's tone suddenly turned cold. No wonder I felt unwell last night. To think that you lured me to your room with Liv's whereabouts. Did you add something to my drink? Ethan, I did that because I love you so much. You keep turning down my feelings, so I didn't have any other choice. You had this coming. Are you happy now? Guilt crept upon her heart. I know. It's all my fault. I bet Yale has already apologized to you. But did it even mean anything? He sneered. If it did, you wouldn't have called me, begging for me. Crystal, there's a saying that goes, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. When you set me up, did you never think how unfair it would be for me? Crystal choked with tears. I regret it so much, Ethan. Please. His icy voice rang into her ears. Take responsibility for what you've done, Crystal. Besides, do you think I'm that crazy or foolish to help out a woman who has set me up? I'll bring a grand wedding gift for the both of you. Congratulations on your marriage in advance. The call terminated, leaving her wailing. No, she regretted her actions. But what was there that she could do? Olivia, who was wrapped tightly in Ethan's arms, raised her eyebrow. You knew that Yale was going to do something. He's just a rabbit I drove to the corner. His only way out is to latch onto the Heath family. All these years, he has been doing things for Crystal. The fact that he looked for Mr. Gatsby has raised Mr. Heath's suspicions. Yale heard that the Heaths wanted me to marry Crystal and grew anxious. He wouldn't let last night's opportunity slip through his fingers. Does he love Crystal? Love? A mercenary like him loves only his status and power. He has no thoughts about love. The glint in his eyes slowly darkened. People like us are always entangled with strings. Aren't you offbeat, then? Ethan tapped the tip of her nose. I have the power to do so. The Millers have accumulated so much wealth for centuries. Even if I don't get involved in this business, I have nothing to worry about. But it's different for the Kingstons. Then what do you think Mr. Heath will do? He might agree to this marriage. Yale called the prominent figures in his family over just for that. Do you think that Mr. Heath will object to it? He needs to consider his reputation when his daughter has done such a thing. So, I guess we can say that the Heaths will be backers for the Kingstons in the future. You can say that. Although Mr. Heath doesn't like Yale, he has to accept reality because the families are on the same team now. What he's accepting isn't Yale but the good he can gain from this situation. Liv, reality is crueler than you think it is. Olivia smiled faintly. I learned it very well when my father was hospitalized. But, Ethan, don't you regret not siding with the Heaths? Chapter 1147. Ethan hugged Olivia, burying his face in her neck. Liv, as I said, my family owns so much money that it's enough to sustain us for a few lifetimes. As for power, there's nothing I'm afraid of other than God. What Yale desires is something I don't care about. Power is just a tool to protect my family and you. Even without Crystal, I have other ways to gain it. The most important person to me is you. He spoke into her ear softly. Don't drive me away, Liv. You're my everything. She flicked his forehead. Control yourself. This is the Heath residence. How are we going to explain if someone sees you in my room? If you drive me out right now, that's no different from announcing that I spent the night here. Olivia went silent for a moment. So, what are we gonna do? When the night comes, I'll get out of here through the camera blind spots. There are guards outside. I have my ways. She was rendered speechless. But Liv, I'm starving. What would you like to eat? I'll make you something in the kitchen. The cheeky Ethan pinned her on the couch. No need for the hassle. I can help myself. Back in the living room, the elderly people in the Kingston family were present. Yale's call even managed to summon the 85-year-old Sherman Kingston. Yale's uncles were here too. The majority of the household was involved in politics, especially Sherman, who was once Mason's superior. Mason's mood was terrible. He had never liked the feeling of conceding to someone. Still, he maintained a smile on his face. Sherman wanted to rise from his seat as soon as he saw Mason. Mason, please be seated, Mr. Kingston Sr. Be careful not to fall. Mason motioned at Tatiana. She quickly supported Sherman. I can't believe that Mr. Kingston Sr. is here too. Yale, how unbecoming of you. It's windy, and the road is slippery out there. Aren't you afraid that he might catch a cold? He's an old man, Sherman hurriedly said. Don't blame him. I was there when he called his father. This brat was foolish enough to do such rude things to Miss Heath. I thought I should pay you a visit in person to apologize. Yale's father, Gordon Kingston, said instantly, Mr. Heath, Mrs. Heath, I raised my son wrong. I should send him to hell for committing such a sin. He then whipped Yale. How could you do that, you brat? Get to your knees and apologize to Miss Heath. Hurry. The whip landed on Yale again and again. Mason knew that it was a planned show to elicit pity from them. Gordon didn't hold himself back in order to make it seem real. Meanwhile, Yale knelt on the floor without groaning in pain. It was not until the fifth whip that Mason suddenly said, Stop. This is not entirely Yale's fault. Don't stop me, Mr. Heath. I'll punish him in front of you so that he'll learn his learn. How dare you lay a finger on Miss Heath? Go to hell. Adalia cried while tugging on Tatiana. Mrs. Heath, I'm terribly sorry for not raising my son right. It's all because he's head over heels for Miss Heath. He has loved her for so many years, and he was swept up in the moment. As his mother, I have nothing to say to cover up his mistake. Why don't you punish me as well? Today, Tatiana had met her competitor in terms of shamelessness. Chapter 1148. Yale ruined her plans, and resentment took root deep in Tatiana. She hated it so much, but she had to go along with their performance. That's an overstatement, Mrs. Kingston. This has nothing to do with you. It's the youngsters' business. Let's take a seat and think of something. You're right, Mrs. Heath. Hubby, stop it. Adalia stopped Gordon. She wiped her tears away while saying, Dad, what should we do? Now, it was time to take it seriously. Sherman looked at the kneeling Yale indifferently. This brat has committed a grave sin. Since he did such a thing to the innocent Miss Heath, I'm afraid there's only one solution for this. Yale has to marry her. Mr. Heath, although my grandson has done no big accomplishment, he's mature and dependable. Please give him a chance to make up for his mistake. He'll use the rest of his lifetime to make up for Miss Heath. Mason gave Tatiana a glance that read, You should be responsible for the grave you dug yourself. Biting the bullet, she feigned magnanimity. Mr. Kingston Sr., please don't blame Yale. It's partly Crystal's fault too. She drank too much last night, and that's why it happened. I watched Yale grow up. He's a nice kid. Adalia hurriedly said, So, I do adore Yale, but this is a different matter. It's unconventional for the parents to have a say in this. Besides, Crystal has always been our pampered daughter. Her opinion matters the most to us. As the veteran, she was adept at pushing the responsibility to others. She beckoned a maid over. Call Crystal over. This is about her future. We should discuss it together. Everyone didn't look great. Obviously, it wouldn't be easy to have the marriage happen. Crystal soon arrived. Her red eyes made her look pitiful. Perhaps the maid had secretly told her what to do. Instead of throwing a tantrum like usual, she sobbed out the words, I hope all of you stop blaming him. I'm partly to blame for this. I was hammered last night, so it happened without me realizing it. Miss Heath, do you mean that? Mrs. Kingston, I don't blame him, and I don't want to hold him responsible for it. Let's put an end to this. How could we just let it be? Our son took advantage of you, so he must be held responsible for it. What happens if word gets out? What will people think of us? Tatiana smiled. Mr. Kingston, we're the only ones aware of this incident. I believe that you won't spread rumors about it, will you? Mrs. Kingston, Mr. Yale is a nice person, but I don't like him. It won't be a happy marriage. Crystal suddenly acted demurely. If we force the marriage to happen, it'll only bring us trouble and problems. We're both in the wrong for what happened. The blame isn't entirely on one party. Yale didn't expect her to be this calm. She clearly didn't want a marriage with him. Holding the armrest, Sherman looked at Mason. Mason, I heard of this incident and came with a heart of sincerity. If Miss Heath is willing to marry Yale, I'll offer half of our assets for her wedding gift. I hope that Yale can have his wish granted too. After all, he has liked Miss Heath for so many years. She has also been single for a long time. It'll be great news for them to get married. Chapter 1149. Judging from how the Kingstons came in a group, they were clearly dogged to achieve their objectives at all costs. If the proposal was turned down, Crystal's and the Heaths' reputation would be ruined. On the other side of the coin, accepting the proposal would mean a tiring future ahead of Crystal. She failed to win the heart of her loved one, and the person she didn't love did everything in his power to marry her. It was an ill fate. Mr. Kingston Sr., I'm aware of your sincerity. Similar to my wife, I have nothing to complain about Yale, but Crystal is my precious daughter. When it comes to marriage, the opinion of the people involved matters more to us. That's how it works within my family. Now that things have turned out this way, I suggest putting the proposal aside first. Why don't we give both of them some time to spend together? The smile on Tatiana's face beamed wider. Yale thought, this sly fox. Still, he remained respectful on the outside. Do you mean, they can get to know each other as a couple for 3 months? If a deeper relationship is developed, it won't be too late to hold a marriage when the time comes. Mason looked at Sherman. Mr. Kingston Sr., I think this is the best for both of them. What do you think? Since you've put it that way, we agree to it too. You'd better treat your future wife well, you brat, Sherman reminded Yale. Yale nodded. I will, Grandpa. Guys, please be rest assured. I, Yale Kingston, Swear by my name that I will treat Crystal well from now onward. If I happen to go against my word, I'll be punished severely." Crystal rolled her eyes, unable to believe that someone was actually taking it the traditional way in this era. Mason let out a wry cough, reminding her not to ruin it. "Crystal, try to get along with Yale from now on. I know that you like someone else, but he hasn't reciprocated your feelings for so long. You should consider other options. Yale is a good man. I won't force you to get married today, but you have to promise me that you'll get over that person and try to accept others. Give others a chance, as well as yourself. Got it, Dad?" Mason's action as of now was flawless and reasonable. He wasn't a simple man to deal with. Who knew what would happen 3 months from now? After all, he held certain power, so the Kingstons didn't have the nerve to cross the line by threatening him. Mason's history of climbing up the ladder of power was a legend. He had never been an easy opponent. Thus, Yale had to accept the situation regardless of his reluctance. Within 3 months, all he had to do was to impregnate Crystal. Then, the child could be used as leverage to make the marriage happen. Meanwhile, Crystal was thinking, it's just 3 months. When the time comes, I'll say that I don't like him and get out of this. The living room was filled to the brim with people bearing different thoughts in mind. Mason smiled. "No objections. I guess this is it. Mr. Kingston Sr., it's been years since I last met you. Let's play a few rounds of chess. Ladies and gentlemen, please stay and have a meal together. We might be a family in the future. It won't hurt to get to know each other in advance." Yale was impressed by Mason's composure. The latter solved the problem, which Yale had schemed for a long time. Mason resolved it so readily, and the Kingstons couldn't find a fault with him. Mason stood up and patted his shoulder. "Crystal's my only daughter. You'd better treat her well. Don't worry, Mr. Heath. I like her too much to hurt her." Yale held Crystal's hand gently. "Crystal, I'll make you accept my feelings one day." A shudder of revolt made her skin crawl. Chapter 1150. The issue was finally resolved. Tatiana secretly dragged Crystal to an empty corner. Tatiana said in an undertone, "I'm warning you. Your father barely fought a chance for you to make up for your mistake. Don't ruin it. Just get along with Yale like you've always done for the next 3 months. When the time comes, you can separate ways with him by claiming that your characters don't match. Remember, don't let the Kingstons catch on to you." Crystal nodded. "I got it, Mom. Your temper worries me the most. Just stomach everything for the next 3 months. The show has to go on for the families and your reputation." "I will." Crystal clenched her fists. It broke Tatiana's heart to see her daughter like this. She caressed Crystal's head. "Crystal, there's a long journey ahead of you. Ethan is an impossibility. Get over him. Open up your heart and try to accept others, but that doesn't include Yale. He's a scheming man. He's not a good husband material. You mustn't fall for him." Tatiana had always had an eye for people. If they had another way out of this, she wouldn't have allowed Crystal to interact with him. The mention of Ethan being an impossibility evoked sadness in Crystal. Tears trickled down her cheeks, falling onto the snowfield. "Is it really impossible? Accept reality, Crystal. Forget about now. He didn't even accept you when you were still a virgin. Nothing will happen between the two of you. I let you be in the past because he was still single. I thought that there was a chance. But now that I think about your age, it's time that you try accepting others." But I like him, Mom." Tatiana hugged her. "There are so many things that don't go according to our plans, especially when it comes to love. It isn't something you can buy with money or gain through power. Besides, the Millers don't need that stuff." Crystal sobbed like a little kid. Ethan had been the man of her dreams since she was young. She had pursued him for so many years. She served the army for him and slogged through difficult training, even going on missions with him in the wild. Her sole wish was to stay closer to him so that he would look at her. Yet, he suddenly had a secret marriage that year. Crystal waited for a long time for him to divorce and for that woman to disappear. But why didn't it work out? "Don't cry. Go get a bath. You have to have a meal with the Kingstons later. Crystal, it's time to grow up now. Your father is old, and your brother is shouldering heavy responsibility. You grew up under our wing with protection. Now, it's time for you to step up and share the burden with us instead of us cleaning up your mess. As a grown-up, you have no right to fool around anymore. Crystal returned to her room alone. The maid had cleaned up the place for her, clearing up Yale's traces. She was as disappointed today as much as she had anticipated last night. Staring at her tear-stricken face in the mirror, she slapped herself for opting for that route. If she didn't have distorted thoughts, Yale wouldn't have been able to seize the opening to take advantage of her. Ethan was right, she had it coming. Crystal regretted it so much. But regret couldn't do anything about it. Grown-ups had to take responsibility for their mistakes. Crying or throwing a tantrum couldn't solve anything. At long last, she accepted the reality that it was impossible for Ethan and her. Meanwhile, the man she desired was drenched in sweat. Olivia wrapped her arms around Ethan's waist. "Ethan, are you mad? Live, let me die on you."